So today we are releasing another guest episode on Chalchitra Talks. For this episode, we have Uday Bhatia with us. Uday is a film critic and he writes for Mint Lounge. So Uday is going to share 5 movies जिनके उन्हें soundtracks या score बहुत पसंद है. So over to Uday for the recommendations.
So I'm going to recommend 5 films that have memorable scores. And I'm going to also try and slip in some mini recommendations within the 5 main ones. It's going to be a fairly eclectic international list. I'm going to skip the Zimmers and the Morricones. So I apologize in advance if I mangle some of the pronunciations. So my first recommendation is Dead Man. It's a Jim Jarmusch film from 1995. They call it an acid western, sort of a psychedelic version of a western. It has Johnny Depp, and he's just wandering around the West in the 1800s. And it has a score by Neil Young, very famous rock and roller. And there are 2 unique things about this score. One is that it is almost entirely improvised. Neil Young sat with a rough cut of the film and he just played guitar to it as the film was screening, and then they cut those into tracks. The other thing is that it's a single instrument soundtrack, and not many of those exist in the history of film where the entire score is played on one instrument. As I said, this is set in the 1800s, and you would think that it would be weird for a film set then to have an electric guitar playing, very heavy electric guitar playing in Neil Young's typical style. But it actually works very well for the film because it's a sort of hallucinatory kind of western, and Neil Young's playing also has that quality, and it has a very raw quality. And the film is also really weird and raw. So it works really well in that sense, even though it takes some getting used to. When you have the opening credit, you just hear that electric guitar, but like it's a period setting. If you like this particular soundtrack, then I would advise you to go way back to The Third Man, which is, I think, the granddaddy of the single instrument soundtrack. It was a noir film. It had Joseph Cotten and Orson Welles. And it was recorded by a person called Anton Karas. And he recorded it on a zither, which is a string instrument. And it was just that. And it was very novel for its time, having just one instrument. But it's absolutely brilliant. The film is also a classic, and the soundtrack was also very, very popular. Since we're talking about improvised soundtracks, another one I would suggest would be this French new wave film called Elevator to the Gallows. Miles Davis, who's the great jazz trumpeter, he did it in a manner very similar to how Neil Young did Dead Man, which is that he got rushes of the film, and then he stood in the studio and he actually like improvised his trumpet while seeing the action of the film. And you can actually see a clip of this on YouTube where he's playing and the film is running. My second reco is a very classic world cinema film by Werner Herzog. It's called Aguirre, The Wrath of God from 1972. It's a very one-of-a-kind film set in, I think, probably the 16th century. It has these Spanish conquistadors going down the Amazon looking for El Dorado. And because it's a Werner Herzog film, things don't go very well, and nature intervenes. So the score for this is done by this German electronic band of that time called Popul Ver. And they've done a soundtrack for a couple of other Herzog films also. It sounds, if you hear it, like a choir is singing, but it's a little off. And the reason that it's off is that they had a very unique recording, which was they used something called a choir organ, which is like some 30 simultaneous pre-recorded tracks each one of which is a voice at a particular pitch. And then you literally play a choir through the organ, which gives it this sort of very ethereal quality, but also kind of weird and creepy, which suits the film very well. So Popul Verse soundtrack, and you should also hear the soundtrack for his Nosferatu horror film, his Dracula film. Quite brilliant. And I like this idea of pre-recording sounds and then combining them to create a new sound. If you like this, perhaps you might want to listen to the Chernobyl soundtrack. Which is by Hildur. I'm not going to attempt her surname. Brilliant soundtrack. And what she did was she went to a nuclear power plant in a hazmat suit with another record. And she actually recorded sounds from there. And she brought them back, and then she combined that to make the score. So apparently the score for Chernobyl is entirely constructed out of sounds that are from a decommissioned nuclear power plant. My third pick is a Brazilian animated film from 2013. It's called Boy and the World. It's directed by Ale Abreu, and the score is by Ruben Pfeffer and Gustavo Corlat. So it's a beautiful film. Sort of made for kids, I guess you could say, but very enchanting. Just like it's about a boy who sets out from his home in search of his migrant worker father, and he goes through like fields and cities, and he encounters all sorts of things in the world. It's also a wordless film. There is hardly any dialogue, and whatever dialogue is there is basically gibberish. It's a made up version of Portuguese. So it's really, there are no words. So it's an 80-minute feature film, but only the visuals carry it and the music carries it. And the score is quite brilliant because it's everything that is happening on in the film is basically incorporated into the score because there is no dialogue. Sound design becomes music, becomes sound design, becomes a score. So there is absolutely no division between all that. So say like if a flute is playing, you'll think that that is part of the background. Then actually they'll cut to a bird in the forest, and you'll realize that actually, it was actually sound design, maybe not the score. So it all sort of blends into one big whole thing. It took 2 years for them to make because they were sort of working so closely with the directors that they almost sort of, in a sense, became directors themselves because they had so much responsibility of carrying the narrative forward through their score. Absolutely brilliant score. And if you like it, you might like this 1959 film called Black Orpheus, which had a score by two very famous musicians called Antonio Carlos Jobim and Luis Bonfa. This film started the bossa nova craze outside of Brazil. Just a sort of magical soundtrack. And the soundtrack is actually more famous than the film, even though the film is well known, but everyone starts talking about the soundtrack immediately when they discuss this film. My next pick is a Japanese film from 1967. It's a gangster film called A Colt Is My Passport. It's by Takashi Nomura. One of the many noir gangster films that were made for the Nikatsu studio at that time. Brilliant films, some of them very funny, violent, sort of, you can see where Tarantino gets some of his ideas from by watching those films. This one stars Joe Shishido, who died earlier this year. Brilliant actor in films by Seijun Suzuki, Branded to Kill, and a couple of others. Great pulp star of that time. And a very fun film, even though maybe not the most famous Nikatsu noir, but really one of the best. So the score by this is by this guy called Harumi Ibe. And from the opening titles itself, it's completely throws you off because it's a spaghetti western score, and this is a gangster film happening in Tokyo. And spaghetti western obviously is not the kind of score that gangster films have, but this was like they just probably felt that this was getting popular over the world, and they were like, let's do it. So it's fine, that happens. It's a very Morricone like score with harmonica and sort of twangy guitars and whistling and all. Then what happens is a couple of scenes later, you hear the same tune, but it's played jazz style, like a small jazz combo is playing it. Same theme, but played jazz style, which is totally like brilliant on part of the film because it's saying that, look, we know that jazz music is what is, associated with noir. You don't have spaghetti westerns, but we gave you that to sort of throw you off balance. Now here is the jazz version of the same thing. Then later in the film, they have the same theme with both the spaghetti western elements and the jazz elements together with it, at which point you can imagine Tarantino's head explode. So absolutely brilliant soundtrack and film. A Colt is my passport. Generally, the Japanese films of the 60s had amazing scores by a bunch of composers. If you're looking for another very adventurous gangster film of that time, which has a very experimental score, there is Masahiro Shinoda's Pale Flower, which has a score by Toru Takemitsu. Strange atonal sort of score, goes into jazz, goes into classical, goes into sort of experimental music. Very unlike anything you would have heard. It's quite brilliant. The film is also brilliant. So if you're interested, you should check that one. My last pick is a film by Bela Tar, the Hungarian director. It's called Workmeister Harmonies. It's from 2000. This is a bit of a sentimental pick by me. It takes me back to the time when I was just getting into world cinema. And this was pre-internet days. So we used to basically go to these CD shops and very shady establishments where they would give you copied DVDs in these plastic packets. In that era, Bela Tar was regarded as one of the directors who was sort of like a heavyweight. Like if you were, getting serious about cinema, then you will be watching like Bela Tar films and you will sit through 9 hours of Saturn Tango. Yeah. But Workmeister Harmonies, not so long, just like 2.5 to 3 hours. And a great score by this composer who Bela Tar works with a lot called Mihaly Vig. Just two themes in the whole film. That's all. There aren't more pieces of music. They're just two pieces of music which he constructs in this. They're both very simple piano, cello, violin sort of things, very slow, kind of mournful music, extremely moving. And the way that Bela Tar uses them in the film when they suddenly sort of come in, it's a black and white film, but they sort of illuminate the screen. And there is just something about Mihaly Vig's scores that, like, even if you had not seen a Bela Tar film ever, and mostly, like, if you haven't seen a Bela Tar film, I'll give you an idea. It's basically like long takes, nothing much happens in terms of plot, and just not too much talking either. So the music does have a lot of impact when it comes in because it's used in a sort of sparing way. If you've never seen his films, this music might actually give you an idea what it would be like just, from the sound of it. It sounds like it's black and white. It sounds like it's a bit mournful, like it's searching for something, like it's sort of wandering around in pursuit of a melody, of a resolution. And so this film has These two pieces absolutely beautiful. If you want to look more, his score for Satan Tango, for Turin Horse, for Damnation, all of these Belatar films, absolutely brilliant. I hope you enjoyed those recommendations, and do subscribe to Chalchitra Talks for movie, book, podcast recommendations.